Hi, my name is Lorene Carey. I'm the author of The Price of a Child, which I'll be reading, at least the first chapter. And I'm very glad to be doing this for Book One Norristown. The Price of a Child. For Lawrence Higgins Smith and Zoe Drayton Smith. Freedom lurked around us, and I understood at last that he could help us to be free if we would listen, that he would never be free until we did. James Baldwin from Sonny's Blues. And from Matthew 21:42. Jesus saith unto them, Did ye never read in the Scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected, the same is become the head of the corner? This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Acknowledgement. I am especially grateful to Phil Lapsansky, research librarian at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And this is where we are, at the Library Company of Philadelphia, where I did a lot of research and learned about Jane Johnson, the woman who escaped here in Philly and whose story inspired this novel. The story was in William Still's The Underground Railroad, self-published in 1872. Chapter 1, Crazy Hope. When Ginny looked at Jackson Pryor, she thought of nothing but how to leave him, like she thought of now for 2 days on end. She expected it to leap out of her throat. Run, run, fast as you can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man. Each time Ginny thought of running away, she hid the thought. He'd see it in her eyes. She tried to force it deeper inside her, but it lay just under the skin. Stubborn. Her eye was jumping. She'd sprinkled herself with orange water Susie had given her, and now she stank of rebellion. He threw another of his pointless compliments her way. You smell nice, he said. I've run away from a little old lady and a little old man, and I can run away from you, I can. They used to make gingerbread all the time. Little brown men with raisins for eyes. Children bit off the heads. Raisin eyes winked at her from the cookie pan in her mind. Gingerbread men grinned, plump and shiny. I run my best. I run pretty close to the hornet's nest. The patrollers run, they run their best. They run right into the hornet's nest. Worse yet, she dreamt of the gray cat, and she couldn't shake off the shadow of the dream, like that's what she needed, to dream up the gray damn cat. It had been a childhood nightmare, stalking her imagination and hissing in her sleep when she was 7 or 8, and her mother, Lily, was loaned out to another farm to sew for a big wedding, leaving her alone in their lean-to cabin. The cat came back to frighten her after her mother, bitter and almost crazy, had coughed up blood and died. Ginny hadn't seen the cat since she'd taken up with Coop almost 15 years before. Like real cats, like Coop, it came and went as it pleased. Its appearance in her anxious sleep felt like a warning, or maybe as if something bad had already happened. I want to travel with my children, she told Pryor, and he'd agreed. Then the bat found out, as she would, of course, since he kept her calmed about the Nicaragua trip by telling her everything or close to everything. The bat had said no children. So Ginny made her own fuss. I'll be no good to you without 'em. Don't threaten me, Ginny. But he did go back to the bat and make a deal, and he came back and plopped their deal in Ginny's lap. The 2 older children, but not Benjamin. So there. Susie'll watch him, he said. Ginny could hear the bat in that scheme. Always planning out somebody's damn life, what they'd eat, what they'd wear, where they'd sleep, and who they'd lay. always trying to direct what happened when she was out of earshot. Nicaragua was out of earshot, so the bat would keep her Benny. Watching Pryor's back all those years had made the bat very shrewd. She made it worse with that pie-faced lie about how they wanted to let him go, wished they could, but how Jenny couldn't do the work Master Pryor required. Now could she, with 3 pickaninnies in tow? She liked to lie, was all Jenny could figure. She must have stayed awake nights, figuring how to look folk dead in the eye and say words that sounded like one thing and meant another. Jenny knew what damn work the master required. His requirements gave her 2 children. Why, shucks, the bat said. If Jenny took 3 children, then they'd have to send somebody to take care of her. Ha, ha, ha. Now that was some funny shit there. Somebody to take care of Jenny. She'd been having nosebleeds since they had left home and dreaming of the gray cat and yams and teeth. Pryor looked hard at her. "We'll only be here for a few hours," he said, as if apologizing. He frowned and squinted at his pocket watch and ran his fingers through his hair. You must be hungry," he said, "you and the children. Matty boy, you hungry?" Pryor's father-in-law had told him not to bring Jenny. "Jackson," he said, "you could not do a worse thing. You always traveled with Mammy Ray." "That was 20 years ago. This is 1855. Things have changed." Pryor pouted and smoked his cigar. "Jenny wouldn't leave me," he said. Now, as she later had cause to remember, he was on her heels every minute. "Yes, sir, I is," Mattie answered. Pryor was an intelligent man, educated in the North, a stickler for hygiene and manners. He'd taught her to speak because it offended him to hear her go too wrong, and he taught her her ABCs because it amused him, and he saw no harm. "I am," he corrected. Jenny had heard it coming. "I am," Mattie repeated. Pryor wrinkled his nose and made a smile at Mattie. It was his best smile. He called him Matty boy, the baby Benny boy. He spoiled them with pennies and candy. Then he turned and wiped the rest of his smile on Jenny. "Cat got your tongue? Huh? I suppose. Traveling will tell on you. Keeps me wound up." Wound up. She knew what that meant. But he was too proud to do anything to take his comfort on the road. He didn't want Northerners to know that he bedded his black servant, so he hired separate rooms while they traveled and locked her in at night. Nobody seemed particularly interested in their evening arrangements, so far as she could tell. That morning, as she'd lain in the last inn, head propped up on her hand to keep the stink of mildewed ticking out of her nose, she'd wondered whether the gray cat had been sent to warn her away from escape or to trick her out of trying. She couldn't tell. Her neck was stiff. She'd been straining to do something in her dreams. Crazy hope rushed through her like water. The muscles under her eye kept jumping, blip, blip, like chipmunks peeking out of their holes, blip. Pryor was watching her, staring at her as if she weren't herself. She wasn't, of course, and he could see. He studied his pocket watch some more. "We all need to eat, I think. That's what we need." He laughed a little. "At least that's what I need. I surely had hoped that we would make Philadelphia in time for the regular New York steamer without all this foolishness about taking a ferry and then getting on some more railroad cars and then ferrying to New York, not to mention this waiting around and whatnot." He sighed and shrugged at her as if the two of them were real companions, old partners journeying together, as if Jenny gave a good shit how they traveled to New York City or who they might meet on the way or how fast they got to Nicaragua so he could start working over them ignorant people down there for their land. Had to be land in it, or money, or both. Why else would he be going? It didn't matter to her anyway. Why should it? Why should she care a damn what advantages he was traveling such a far distance to secure? Travel fast, travel slow. So what? And besides, Jesus have mercy, she might not go along. Run right next to the hornet's nest. I run, I run, I run. She'd been waiting for this stopover like a cat waits under a bush for a dove. She'd been waiting quiet for years and very still. So I'll go on down now and get a bite. Nothing heavy. We don't want nothing heavy. Ginny managed not to look too desperate, but she could not speak either. Naturally, she saw the damned cat in her head. The devil was a busy man.
Ginny's first attempt to slip out of slavery had been 12 years before. Cooper and his brothers Sing and Sam had planned it for themselves, and then, when she popped up pregnant, Cooper figured a way for her to go too. It still made her catch her breath sometimes, as if she were 18 again, thinking herself a woman grown, finding out that her man, as she called Willie, Walleye Willie, Willie the Cooper, Coopy man, Coop, was planning to go, and never a word. That taught her something about thinking she knew somebody, and about how far to trust the tingling in her thighs and the itch at the bottom of her belly. The plan hadn't worked for her. She never made it to where they were supposed to meet because she was missed sooner than she expected, and they sent somebody out to look for her. She walked back to the prior place behind the horse of the overseer's helper. Cooper was gone, and she was hungry. She never forgot the sour hunger on that walk back, or being so sleepy that she could barely move her feet. Jackson Pryor did not punish her for sneaking off, although it was clear in the next few days that Cooper had escaped, and Cooper had been her man. Pryor prided himself on his leniency, as he said. He let it be known that he would not suffer a pregnant woman to be whipped. He did remind her, however, that Cooper had gone with his brother and left her. He mounted a campaign to domesticate her. She'd been a yard dog. Now he'd burn off the ticks and bring her indoors. She prayed that she would not begrudge Cooper his freedom. Cooper and his brother couldn't take bondage. It was that simple. People always said it of them. Some people just couldn't, the way some women couldn't take childbirth. Cooper couldn't take the driver's contempt, or the overseer's authority, or the master's mastery. He couldn't take knowing that the strength in his body fattened another man's belly. He had always wanted to be free. He and his brother, he told her, had wanted to run since they could walk. And when he'd said it, she had recognized what she loved in him. He refused to settle. She loved the part of him that resolved when the overseer threw a melon rind and spoiled his hat to leave at any cost. She was the cost. Their daughter was the cost. Life together for however long they might be together was the cost. They paid. You don't just run. First, you make up your mind. Her father had been like that. After a particularly bad flogging, he decided never to let himself be whipped again. Virgil was a big man with a deep, sharp voice like the voice of God, who let her stand on his foot and hold on to his thigh as he walked. His leg felt stronger than anything. After the whipping, Lily washed Virgil with water and turpentine. The next night, as soon as he was able, he ran away to the woods and stayed for a month, long enough so that Jackson Pryor's father decided to call back the patrollers and send instead a black man to negotiate Virgil's return. In the meantime, the overseer was fired. Virgil came home again to live with his wife and family. He came back changed. He was thin, and his skin and breath smelled like earth. Lily slumped into his arms and wept. Her body heaved with each sob. While he'd been gone, Ginny's older brother had died of a fever. Lily and Ginny cried off and on through the night. Virgil held them on the pallet and rocked them in the dark. "Hush, hush, hush now," he said. The husks made dry groans under them. They breathed in the new smell of him and cried some more. Later he told them how he had escaped from a forest fire so hot that he could hear the pop of rocks cracking open behind him. He figured he'd been in the fire at the same time that his boy, Ginny's brother, had died. Virgil was with them another 8 or 9 months. Then Master Pryor died. In January, the farm had an old-fashioned settling. Traders' wagons rolled up without warning on the first day of the new year. They'd been told about Virgil. They came for him first, grabbing and shackling him fast so that he couldn't run. Lily cried and cursed and screamed and ran after the wagon, and Ginny ran after them both. Virgil shook his head and shouted, "No! Don't make it no worse." Lily stopped in the road. Virgil had made her promise never to forget him and never to let them make her crawl. After Virgil was gone, Lily made it a point to tell her daughter several times that Virgil had made her able to walk. She said that when Ginny was born, her toes were stacked one on top of the other so that she could not have stood straight. Virgil held the little foot on a board with the toes flat, and he tied them down tight so that they would grow straight. "Think of your daddy," Lily said, "every time you run." Ginny thought of her father the day they brought her back from trying to run away with Cooper. Jackson Pryor had the overseer's helper bring her into his study. He didn't ask her whether she tried to run, but he did say he was going to watch her. He also told her that she was too smart to make her life more difficult than it needed to be. She was 18. He was 40. Ginny had always figured that he didn't know as much as he thought he did. But she'd been a young fool, paying more attention to what Pryor didn't know than to what he did. He knew plenty. He'd been raised to make money and take comfort from black people. She sat before him, her big belly, his profit between them, filling the room, pushing aside the memory of her father's resistance. She wasn't running now. "How you going to go, Ginny?" he asked her. "It's not just you. You'll have to take care of your little baby soon, won't you?" He'd have it from her own mouth. She knew something else now, too. That knowing made no difference. Her daddy may have run, and Cooper and his brother may have run, but to her shame, she couldn't. At the end of the day, pain shot through her buttocks and down her thighs. At night, her calves bunched like fists. She wished she could spit in Pryor's face. She could not. She wasn't running. She was sitting, and pitifully glad of it. Lily used to argue with Virgil after he was gone as if he were still lying next to her. "You can say they can't make you do nothing but die. They can't make you crawl. Everybody ain't like you, Virgil." Ginny had been ashamed of her mother. Now she was ashamed of herself. "It's like you say, sir," she said. "Good." Ginny was moved from the washtub to the kitchen. There, she was apprenticed to Susie, who had taken her in as a girl after Lily died. In a few years, Ginny had learned enough to cook in Washington when the captain went on government business. His wife did not always accompany him. Susie saw it coming and warned her. Ginny saw it coming, and it came. Pryor told her he'd been on the lookout for a girl like her for some time. He wanted her to be discreet, only in town, and when his wife stayed in the country. That worked out to once every couple months or so, and usually when he'd been drinking, so it didn't take long. He wanted a gal who wouldn't preen. Ginny didn't tell him she had nothing to preen about. He wanted his comfort, nothing more or less, was how he put it to her and to himself, as if he were on trial. "He lets you take Etta when you go now, huh?" Susie asked. Ginny couldn't answer except to nod her head. Susie had taken her in. She'd cared for her like a mother. Ginny stood embarrassed before her as she would have before her own kin. Quite suddenly her eyes were wet. "Please don't shame me no more," Susie cried with her. "I'm not fault-finding. I know you're doing what you think is right. What else can I do?" Unlike some owners, Ginny'd heard tell, Pryor would not have whipped or thumbscrewed or tied her hand to foot and raped her had she tried to refuse him. But he might have sold her. "I'd have been change in his pocket, Aunt Sue," she said. "I know that, Ginny. You know I know. And you'd have got Etta the same way you got me. That's if we was lucky." Ginny told herself she was fortunate that in these, his middle years, Pryor had moderate habits and little passion. He was clean, and to keep peace with the bat, he behaved most of the time as if nothing ever happened between them. He didn't come at her in the kitchen or swagger or wink. When she got pregnant, the household behaved as if it had just happened on its own, like a haystack catching on fire, or the Virgin Mary. "I've been needing a gal like you for a long time." What he'd meant by a gal like you, she began to realize, was someone who'd make no demands. "Couldn't I be free? It'd be like it is now, only I'd be free." She whispered it offhand, casually. "Well then, what would be the point?" She brought it up periodically, no more than a couple times a year. He'd look thoughtful and surprised. He'd tell her that she was a handsome girl, an excellent woman, that she was comfortable, that he was certain she could ride. He'd tell her that she was a handsome girl, an excellent woman, that she was comfortable, that he was certain she could run a fine home of her own in a place such as Washington, as if she were in doubt, and that he would free her one day, but he couldn't part with her yet. "I need you here." He said it the way children say they need a doll baby or a lump of sugar, because they will not be denied. "What you need is a smack in the ass," old people replied. "You don't need me," she said. "Surely do." The children," she'd say, and he'd nod his head. "The children, of course, in time." In his way, Pryor showed favor to Mattie and then to little Benjamin. The children, he'd said, he would surely free. Surely was his favorite word. Ginny could not be sure of anything. Sometimes she believed him because it helped. Then came Nicaragua. The bat wouldn't go because of the climate, and Ginny found herself pulling out seashells that Cooper had given her 12 years before. They were purple and white and smooth on the inside. She took to carrying them in her pocket. She knew that folk had smuggled themselves onto trains and ships out of Baltimore, that they walked the woods to Pennsylvania, rode hidden in carts, and crated up in boxes to Philadelphia. Each story fed her hope. The whole system of states and laws and slavery leaked like old women sneezing, like old men bleeding into their bowels. They tried to keep it secret, what with the laws and passes and patrollers, the lies on top of lies and shows of force. But slavery leaked. On the one hand it held, on the other it leaked. She might be put in the way to escape, or not. She might get the chance to run and miss it. She might realize her loss that moment, or never even know it had come and gone. She might never ever get the chance. She might try and fail. She might die trying. She might lose the children if she tried, or lose them if she didn't. Who knew? Her mind was making itself up. It clackety-clacked like a wagon full of broken hose. She could hear it storing up resentments and hopes, bits of songs, sarcasm, and bitten-off butt ends of rage littered her head like the tips of cigars around a porch. She sang deep and rough to herself, like she'd sing to a colicky baby. Her time might appear on the Nicaragua trip. She came to believe that. She might recognize it, and it could be in her nature to act. She began to accept the uncertainty of it and the costs. And when she could, she felt as clear and as strong as a waterfall pouring over a sadness hard as bone. By now, her eye was jumping something awful. "I'm going down to the dining room for a bite to eat," Pryor said again. If he didn't stop repeating himself, Ginny thought she would scream. Either that or she'd reach over and grab him by the collar that she'd laundered and ram him up against the wall. "I'd have them send a meal up for you and the children. Do not leave this room," he said it quietly and firmly. "Ginny, you hear me? You and these 2 children," he pointed his finger and smiled at them. "Do not leave this room." Chastising Ginny in front of her own children was the sort of insult that Pryor generally spared her, but he was nervous. She should not have felt as if he had slapped her face, but she did. It wouldn't pass. Ginny could not distract herself, not here in Philadelphia where black people went about their own business. Their own business. Hadn't she seen them wearing tidy bonnets and leather shoes? Frozen out of the infant manufacturing industries, they made their living on the fringes of the industrial boom. They were barbers, dress and shirt and shoe and hat makers, pastry cooks, brick makers and layers, carpenters, coopers, dentists, domestic servants, cracker bakers, cabinet makers, school teachers, sail makers, drivers, house painters, and tanners. They turned up everywhere. Handsome Negroes, well-spoken Negroes, Negroes carrying kid gloves at the train station, speaking better English than white folks at home. She had imagined escape, but she'd never imagined such a place, such a world as this. Here, she could not let Pryor's words pass through her as if she were a grazing animal, sucking up slop from the trough, crapping out pits from rotten leavings. These 2 children was a threat. Ginny recognized it, of course, as he'd meant her to do, reminding her that Benjamin had stayed home. She knew damn good and well where he was, too far away to visit on Saturday night roads, crowded with black men on their way to visit their wives, carrying with them their dirty clothes and parcels of food. Hadn't she asked to bring him? Hadn't she risked arousing suspicion by pressing Pryor on it, even after the bat had told him to make Ginny leave Benny home? Ginny bore it like a champion, though, like fighters who take a hit to the face and keep on standing, or wives. She didn't flinch, even though she knew they were holding Benny Boy for surety. She saw the chance of a chance to run and its price. Ginny disciplined herself. She'd let maybe be maybe until she could get close enough to see for sure. In the meantime, she wouldn't flinch. "You sit tight right here, y'all hear me?" Jenny avoided Pryor's eyes. Her temples burned. The arteries and veins in her neck stood out. She could feel the blood surging through. She was breathing too hard. Her jawbone ached with holding still to keep in her voice. "You hear me, Jen?" She nodded, and he left. With Pryor gone, 6-year-old Maddie began to gallop about the room, playing horsey. Jenny turned toward him and put a finger over her mouth. He didn't mind fast enough. She strode across the room, grabbed him by the arm, jerked him hard enough to make him cry out, and then steered him to the wing chair where Willietta sat, silent and scared. Etta's frightened eyes angered Ginny as much as Maddie's antics. Maddie squirmed in her grip. Ginny slapped him, and as soon as her hand hit his arm, she felt a muscle snap in her back. It coiled up under her shoulder blade, the place where Susie had said wings would sprout in heaven. Ginny snorted at the thought. The pain was on the right side, so she used her left hand to grab the material in the front of his shirt and lift him off the chair. "Make me speak to you again," she hissed. "You just make me, and so help me God, I'm gonna whip the black off of you." She banged on the side of the chair to keep from hitting him again. "I'm gonna hurt you, boy." She could feel it, the pounding inside her, telling her to get him right, so he wouldn't misbehave again. Who knew what would happen to them in the next few hours? "I'm gonna hurt you, Matthew. I feel like tearing somebody up. Can you see that?" "Yeah." "What you say?" "Yes'm." "Who you think that gonna be?" he mumbled. "What do you say?" "Me." She dropped him into the chair beside Etta. He pulled the edge of the cushion between his legs and rocked, pouting and coughing. He had a cold. "Did I give you a kerchief before we left?" "Yeah, use it." Ginny stepped to the door that opened onto an ornamental balcony. Below her clamored the city, where even the stables were built of brick and stone. Philadelphia had grown in 30 years from a town into a big city. Its population, swelled by thousands of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Italy, had doubled in the same time and would soon reach 500,000. Horses' hooves clopped on cobblestone streets, and wagons, hand-pulled carts, and shiny black cabs clattered and jostled and rolled. Philadelphia overflowed with noise and smells. The grid that William Penn had begun 200 years before repeated itself west and north and south from the Delaware River. Block after block sprouted rows of red brick houses. In the oldest sections, shacks, shanties, and backyard houses squeezed between the rows in the damp, airless alleys and courts without privies or hydrants, with neither sun nor wind to refresh the inhabitants. Immigrants, minorities, political groups, charitable and social societies founded clubs to give them the companionship and services that the old town had once provided. They formed closed-off social knots of like people who wrapped themselves in identities as narrow as the alleys. And the neighborhood sprawled on, planned not according to the social needs of its citizens, but the real estate agents' profits. Visitors from Europe found the sameness dreary and insularity confusing. After an hour's walk in Philadelphia, Charles Dickens claimed that he would have given the world for a crooked street. But to Ginny, the spreading anonymity looked like hope. She and her children could slip into these streets and disappear. One brown-skinned man with a wavy black queue bobbing out from the back of his hat was selling oysters from a cart on the street. He spoke to passers-by in a nasal twang, casual and familiar, When no one was by, he sang out as if to keep himself company. "Oyster man! Oyster clams!" He shook his bottle of red sauce and polished glass salt and pepper shakers, which caught the sunlight. He sharpened his knife. He had a spry body and deft hands. Above him, above his customers, and the rows and rows of straight up and down brick buildings, the sky stretched clear and blue. Ginny had never tasted an oyster. Susie had always wanted to try one. Ginny whirled to face her children. The room was spacious and bright, but it was a pen. They were penned in like hogs. Ginny made a grunting noise in her throat. For a moment the children stopped and looked at her. Then Mattie began to whine. Etta cuffed him. Ginny went to them. She took their hands and spoke quietly. She told them that they'd have to be a little man and woman and sit still. She threatened Mattie with another whipping and went to the door. Mattie lay back in the chair. He tried to suck his thumb, but his nose was too clogged for him to suck and breathe at once. So he sulked even more. Then Ginny cracked the door. From the hall came the sound of a woman humming to herself. Jackson Pryor saw how agitated Ginny had become now that they were waylaid in Pennsylvania. His father-in-law had warned him. Still at 52, Jack felt that he was entitled to a few comforts. He'd be in Nicaragua who knew how long, and although he was a man of moderation, he wanted his gal around. A little brown skin now and then calmed nervous tension. It balanced the manly fluids and kept him vigorous. Jack didn't want any nasty old whores and foreigners. He liked his gal. She knew him. She was clean. She cooked to his liking and kept his clothes. He told his wife, who had pouted, and his in-laws that Ginny wouldn't run. She was well cared for and obedient. He'd had her since she was a girl, and if loyalty wasn't sufficient, she was smart enough to see how slim were her chances and how much she stood to lose. Besides, he'd scheduled carefully to keep them moving once they crossed the Mason-Dixon line. Ginny would be with him on the steamer from Pennsylvania to New York. Joellen had put the cap on it, though, when she insisted that they leave Benny Boy home. Jack had argued against it. Benny Boy was his favorite. It was a shame that his only sons had to be by Ginny and not Joellen, but there it was. Sons of his old age, both healthy as foals and sharp as tacks. Benny Boy particularly. He laughed and cooed and talked. He sang songs. Sing a song. Next day, he'd sing it right back. He'd cut teeth early and crawled early, and he ran around on his toes, delighting everyone who saw him. Ginny kept after Jack to free the boys, and although he hadn't told her, he'd already made out a portion of land for them in his will. They could share it, the L-shaped corner of land near the creek. Joellen wouldn't like it, but she'd have to keep still. Jack Pryor wasn't like some swine who'd sell their own. So no harm in leaving Betty home. It would keep Joellen quiet, just in case Ginny got ideas. It would keep her in line. She'd be back to Benny in a year or two when Jack's commission ended. But as Jack sat in the dining room of Bloodgood Hotel, sipping a glass of ale and waiting for his soup, he couldn't help being disturbed by Ginny's obvious excitement. He remembered how each Christmas and Easter she'd come sidling up, worrying him about why couldn't she be free and wouldn't he free the boys. She'd had sense not to talk about didn't he care for her and whine and cry like some gals would. But damned if she wasn't persistent. Water dripping on a rock, you could set your calendar by her, come to think, twice a year, like the equinox. Oh, well, he thought, another 2 hours and they'd be on the ferry on their way to New York, surely. Then to Nicaragua. He'd chat her up and send the food. The 2 hours would pass and he could rest easy. 2 hours wasn't long. Besides, she had 2 children and no money. How much trouble could she get herself into? Ma'am, excuse me, ma'am, Ginny whispered. Over here. She was a woman with leathery, oatmeal-colored skin and a wide face. She wore an apron. From the doorway, Ginny motioned for her to come into the room. You need something? Please, step in. The woman came warily. My children and me are on our way to New York with our master, and I'm trying to get free. She whispered the whole story about how Master Pryor was headed for Nicaragua, where he'd be the U.S. ambassador, and about how they were taking the boat that afternoon. Ginny spoke as nice and congenial as she could, knowing suddenly that she had to make this woman her friend. It made her talk too much, too crazy, too fast. What did the woman care for Nicaragua or New York or ambassadors? The point was that Ginny needed to get sneaked out of the hotel. The woman squirmed and looked away. What could Ginny say to make them seem like decent people instead of good-for-nothing gimme niggers, crying please, 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 and never know nothing in return? Can't you help us? Gotta be a back door. What steps do y'all use? Finally, she shut herself up. It was too late. What steps do y'all use? The woman looked as if she'd been slapped. 50 wrinkles turned into 150s. I am so sorry for you. I am, she said. She made a sorry face. Impatience peeked through. But I wouldn't know how to begin. I wouldn't know where to take you or nothing. There'd be no hope with me. None at all. She sounded determined to put Ginny off. I'm working now. She backed out of the room and closed the door. Ginny sat down on the side of the bed. She was breathing as fast as if she'd toted a load uphill. Bitch, she breathed. The knot in her back balled up as if on purpose to break her spirit, like that big-faced woman had been sent to break her. The children stared at her, eyes wide and terrified. Ginny felt dizzy, and her heart flailed around in her chest. The door opened. Pryor appeared, asking whether or not the food had come and whether or not she needed anything. Jesus God, he'd come close. She felt as nervous as if she'd been laying up in bed with another man. He wore the same falsely bright face he'd worn when he left. No, sir, no food yet. I heard somebody in the hall just now, but I looked out. It wasn't nobody but the cleaning woman. Well, just let me go see what's holding it up, shall I? Uh-huh. I'd appreciate that. Thank you. Then he left. Ginny watched the children's faces. Etta tried to mask her alarm. Maddie, who didn't quite understand what was going on, fidgeted as usual. Against the striped green damask upholstery, they looked small and dirty. She turned away, hating herself for seeing them that way, hating the colored woman who could back out of the room into her own private life, hating Pryor with his two-faced concern, hating God for letting them keep Benny in Virginia, hating the call inside to give in. She could feel it coming on from somewhere inside, cramping, threatening, like a miscarriage. They done broke you now. Hope you don't never have to trust no white folk, nor depend on no niggers either. Jenny's mother used to say with a bitter bark and squinch her beautiful almond eyes at Jimmy, who knew, when her mother looked at her, that she appeared every bit as wretched as her own children looked now. God damn. Jenny whispered to the ceiling, enraged tears pricked hot behind her eyes. They held back despair that waited patient as death in the corner of her soul. I could go find somebody, Etta said. She was beautiful, as Lily had been. But unlike Lily, Etta toted her beauty skittishly, like a poor man out on the road carrying too much money. She'd been all right at Pryor's. Pryor had no teenage sons. But she wouldn't have been all right for long. I could go find somebody, Etta said. She was beautiful, as Lily had been. But unlike Lily, Etta toted her beauty skittishly, like a poor man out on the road, carrying too much money. She'd been all right at Pryor's. Pryor had no teenage sons, but she wouldn't have been all right for long. Look at Ginny, and she wasn't nearly as pretty as Etta would be. Mama, Etta spoke haltingly to Ginny's back, because Ginny was staring at the doorknob. It was an exquisite piece of work, the doorknob was, round and smooth, with brass polished to a shine. Goddamn doorknob. Ginny heard her daughter's voice, but couldn't take in her words. Say again, baby. I said I could go for you. I could slip right out and find a man, a color man out there maybe. Etta had seen them too, riding in, the stout and handsome colored people, looking for all the world like prosperous cousins preparing their welcome. A mischievous, twinkling-eyed man at the train depot had tipped his cap to Ginny. Etta gestured toward the window and stopped in mid-sentence because imagination had taken her no farther than finding someone to help. Ginny turned to look at her daughter. Although she favored Lily, Etta had Cooper's mouth and his smile. Neither of them smiled often. Ginny remembered making Cooper laugh at night in the cold cabin. She remembered his hands wrapping around her waist and scooping her toward him on their pallet. She remembered the warmth of his chest against her back, the back of her legs against the front of his, the comfort and the bullying of his body. She recalled his touch with leisure, as if she were not a terrified woman trying to run away in broad daylight in a strange city where she had no family or friends, but some dotty white lady sitting plump and naked at her vanity table, filling the time, pretending to be good-looking, and pretending that because she was white, good looks could do anything for her besides get her big and pregnant like a horse with a belly full of grass. Ginny used to joke like that with serious old, deep-running Stillwater, Willie the Cooper. It was about the only time he ever laughed. She'd do voices and pretend to be different people. She'd mimic how the white grandmother in the house would sit looking at herself like there wasn't squat to do in the world except sit and wait for some nice Negra to come get you your next hot meal. Ginny would sit on the side of their pallet, legs crossed under her, combing and braiding her hair. Every few minutes she'd turn to Cooper and ask, with a faraway look and a breathy voice, "Is it time for supper yet?" Then she'd answer brusquely, like Susie when nobody was around, "No, ain't time for no supper yet. You know you just had your dinner. Live to eat." "Oh, I see. How about tea? How about tea? I could almost swear for tea time. Now, don't tell me no. You go run and go see." Cooper would laugh until tears slid out the corner of his eyes to his ears. It had been a long time since Ginny had made funny. She kicked my ass. That old white lady did. The grandmother kicked my ass. Through the years, Ginny said it with feeling as she rubbed the shiny scars on her buttocks and the backs of her thighs. Of all the people there, it was the old grandmother beat the hell out of me. One day the bat would be an old grandmother, and she'd beat some poor child, no doubt. It wouldn't be Benny, though. Pryor set great store by that little boy. But did he love him? Did he see himself in him enough so they wouldn't sell him? Would he let Susie bring him up and then settle something on him? A few good acres or enough money to let him start a business or go to school? Thinking. "Mama, I'ma go," Etta stood. "No, you don't have to go." Etta's mind rushed like water downhill. "Sit down, Etta," she said. Ginny's mother, Lily, had gotten mean at the end. She held her up by the hand and beat her so bad that she wrenched the girl's shoulder right out of the socket. They came and picked Ginny off the floor and dragged her mother outside. And old Homer took his big hands and snapped Ginny's arm back into place. She observed the moment in her mind, saw herself howl and shake, as Homer came toward her, talking about, "Hold still." Thank God for Uncle Homer, she thought. Thank God for Susie, who took her in the night after Lily died and now cared for Benny. Before they left, Susie had looked at her tearily. She'd always been a big crybaby, produced $2 tarnished and said, "Just in case." Jenny had tried to make excuses. "Well, now," Susie said, "if you don't need 'em, just bring 'em back."
Maybe the chambermaid had been a sign. Jenny looked again at her children. How could they not be shabby and thin? Jenny watched Matty squirm. He was going to be sure enough trouble one day. Not Etta, but Matty would. They'd want to knock the piss out of him, and they could likely kill him in the process. "No, Etta, you not going to find nobody. We'll stay together unless I say different. You hear me? Could be patrollers in this city. You know who I'm talking about." Etta nodded her head. Sure, she knew. Etta was kind-hearted. She was thinking about Benny Boyd, too. Jenny could tell. "Etta, I'm doing the best I know how." Etta's eyes were sad and afraid. She nodded. Jenny went to their chair. She bent down and put her arms around them. "Y'all with me. Y'all gotta be with me. Listen to me. I hold my breath, you hold yours. You hear? If I look surprised, you look surprised. You know what I'm trying to do." Matty looked confused, but when Etta nodded, he nodded too. "Did I say it's going to happen?" They shook their heads no. "But I said I'm a try. God is my witness, I'm a try." Then she smiled, suddenly, sincerely, and rubbed the smooth skin on their cheeks. The feel of them gave her courage. If worse came to worse, Jenny thought, she might have to send Etta after all, but not yet. Nignag saw the chambermaid go into the room. He heard what the women said. It made him scared to hear. He had to tell somebody. He had to tell one of the vigilance men. He had to tell them, but maybe he couldn't. He felt the tickle in his throat just before it began, the neighing and snorting that erupted him like a hiccup and lasted as long as it would. The chamber pot sloshed. He steadied it against his body and hurried down the stairs, out back to empty it in the big privy. George was there, too. Nignag tried to explain about the woman upstairs, but he couldn't get it all out because the neighing was too bad. George got the room number, but not much else before the boss called him to come quick back to the kitchen. Nignag was scared. George could write. He could write notes, and he knew the men to give them to. "You gotta go," George said to him under his breath. "You go. You seen what we do. Talk to her. Find out how long she'll be here and where's she going. Ain't nobody else gonna miss you. Then come on back. I'll write a note for Mr. Still. You know him, right? And Mr. Williamson." George had gotten work at the hotel for Nignag because he felt sorry for him. The young man lived in George's alley. He was an outside boy, and for a few days in winter, George had let him sleep on his floor. But George and his wife had just one room of a two-room house, and Nignag barked and switched and twitched so bad when the weather broke that Marie put him out. He took up with two men, Jack and Bobo, in a rougher, poorer court nearby. George suspected them of an unnatural affection, but Marie would not have Nignag back. Besides, they looked after him, and he wouldn't freeze to death. In any event, he stayed, but he still came around hungry. George wouldn't give him money, but when he could, he found him a day's work and a plate of food. "Go on, you," George said. He took off at a trot toward the kitchen, stopped suddenly and turned. "Then come back to me and let me know what happened. I'll tell you what to do next. Go on now." "Good boy." Nignag ran upstairs. He began to hiccup. "Breathe, boy. Breathe, goddammit, or else lay there and die." Knick-Knack's uncle's voice commanded him from the grave. He too had had the malady, the uncontrollable noises and cursing and coughing that erupted from inside him. He died drunk in the shed above the stables where the two of them had lived together, having suffocated during an attack on an apple stolen from the horse's barrel. Knick-Knack reached the top of the stairwell. The empty chamber pot dangled from his hand. He stopped to breathe. Nice and easy. Then he tried to move the fluttering down somewhere where it wouldn't do any harm. He pushed it to his feet. Knick-Knack felt clever to have quieted himself. Now his toes jerked, but it was better than neighing. Sometimes Knick-Knack thought that other people, smart people, could not do what he did inside his body. He was sharper than they knew, plenty sharp, and a lot of stupid bastards could talk pretty and make money and poke women. And he couldn't. It made him want to go to Juniper Street and get some whiskey from the whores. That's all they'd sell him. A white gentleman was backing out of the room. "I've had a word with them, and the food'll surely be here in a few minutes. Y'all just stay put," he said. The white gentleman closed the door and stood by it a moment like he didn't want to leave. Then he walked down the hall to the front staircase. He did not notice Knick-Knack, who watched, open-mouthed, from the rear staircase, polishing the chamber pot with a rag that hung from his apron tie. When he heard the gentleman's footsteps on the treads, Knick-Knack walked to the woman's room, but he couldn't bring himself to knock. Ginny heard his step and opened the door. Knick-Knack bobbled the chamber pot. She pulled him into the room and closed the door behind him. He was a smooth-faced boy with an odd but appealing face. His mouth hung open. "Listen," she said. "Listen to me. I need help. Look at me. You know the kind of help I'm talking about." He grinned because he knew that already. She frowned at him. "Can you help me?" Her voice became sharp. "Can you show me how to get out? Is there people near here who could help us? Can you go get somebody else?" Two children stared at him from a large chair across the room. Knick-Knack nodded yes, and then shook his head no. He started to hiccup and put up his finger. "I know somebody," he said. The woman's master was taking her onto the next ferry boat to Camden. They'd missed the noon steamboat from Philadelphia to New York, so he determined, the master, to cross the river and catch the train. In New York, they were scheduled to board a ship to Nicaragua, where her master would be the United States ambassador. Knick-Knack knew that he had heard as much as he could remember. He wanted her to stop unless what she was saying would change his instructions. He still had to go to George, and George would send him to Mr. Still and Mr. Williamson. Much as she might go on at him, that's still what he was supposed to do. Knick-Knack put his finger to his mouth to tell her to be quiet, but she kept talking low and fast into his ear, her long fingers wrapped tight around his arm. The children stared at him. He noticed the stink of his apron and the grime crusted on his palms. "I heard Pryor say," the woman told him, hissing even more than before, "that the ferry boat leaves at 3 o'clock. That's no more than an hour, I figure. That's all the time we have. Do you hear me, boy? Don't need to, well, get somebody. We don't have time for that. Just sneak us out the back." Knick-Knack shook his head violently. She talked on. What was she talking about? "No," he said. "I can't." He hiccuped the word can't. It erupted with a spray of spittle in her face. Ginny's head snapped to the side. She swore to herself under her breath. Knick-Knack cringed. "Oh, Christ," she said to herself. "Oh, Jesus, I can't stand no more of this." Knick-Knack grinned at the woman. She did not smile back. "You can't hardly talk, can you?" He gave a sheepish shrug. He could talk, but she was scaring him. She looked to him as if she were going to beat him. Don't hit me. Don't hit you, you say. Ginny looked from the children to the idiot and back again. Come to think of it, she did feel like giving him a good slap. Might do her some good. Ain't nobody gonna hit you. Ginny slumped against the arm of the chair. For a moment, she gave up. She could almost taste relief at the back of her tongue. Benny. Then Knick-Knack neighed. He hit himself on the behind, gave a little hop, and scampered out of the room on jerky feet. Ginny stood by the door, her hand on the beautiful brass knob. Maybe she would just walk out. She'd go down the back staircase out of the hotel and into one of the alleys. Then what? Under a bridge by the river, in the alleys? An outhouse, a stable? She'd find a stable and get into the loft with her children until dark. Or else she might leave Etta in one stable or somewhere else they'd never find her. Or maybe with someone, like that oysterman maybe. Not him, but someone like him. A Negro woman with children of her own. Then she'd take Mattie with her, 'cause she sure as hell couldn't leave him anywhere alone. This time, the knock did not make her shriek. She was too worn out. She was crashing down from crazy hope into desperate certainty. They'd go out and find a stable to hide in. Now that she had a plan, Ginny was able to calm herself. She opened the door to a round-faced young black man carrying a tray of food. George waved his hand at her with authority. She closed the door and stood with her back to it. As she put down the tray and laid out the food, this new man asked whether or not she was the one he was looking for. He had an accent that she'd never heard. She nodded, astonished. And how long you be stopping here at Bloodgood's, madam? No one had ever called Ginny madam. Not long. Have you any idea how long? Till 2:45. The ferry to Camden, ma'am? Yes, sir, I suppose so. The young man looked at her for a long time. He was memorizing her, she knew. The smell of cooking grease wafted off his clothes and skin. There is a committee of men who watch for fugitives. They call them vigilants. I will get them word, but the only thing is that you cannot move. You cannot give away what is to come. They will find you. He took a deep breath. Truth is, of course, and well you know it, there's very little time. But if we can't move fast enough, they'll telegraph New York for you. If no one approaches you here, then look out for 2 men to meet you there and take you with them. Either way will come for you. You understand? That's the end of chapter 1. But while I was here at the library company, the scene that I read, the scene that kept playing and playing and playing in my mind, was the actual escape. You read it, someone else will read it for you in chapter 2. But let me just give you a little taste of what happened on the ferry boat, just a few blocks down from here at Dock Street, here in Philadelphia. The clouds above so lazy, nothing to do but drift, and the sky behind them. She almost floated up out of her body like in a dream, and into the blue sky that didn't laugh or cry, to kiss her baby's fat cheek and hold her lips to the corner of his mouth and smell his breath sweet like milk. But she held herself in. She held herself to the boat and these 2 children and the bench she sat on, and her sore feet in her ill-fitting shoes. Goddamn Pryor. She could not run or fly or float, but she could stand. It was all she could do. Ginny stood. I'm not free! Her voice ripped up the silence. Excitement shot from behind Tyree's navel into his chest. His head pounded in the sun under the sweaty hat. raspy and shrill and scared, her voice erupted again. He could hear it just barely. But I want my freedom. I always wanted to be free. I always wanted to be free.